Everybody, the U.S. in the grips of a stifling heat wave. It is late July and it's hot out there. Triple-digit temps breaking records all across New England. Blame for at least one death here in New York City. Current heat advisories stretch from the eastern seaboard all the way to the Pacific Northwest. Affects tens of millions of Americans. It's also raising the risk for large-scale blackouts. Keep an eye on that story. Get an update for you at the bottom of the hour momentarily here. Meanwhile, the White House painting a rosy picture of the economy, but are the American people buying it? Grand question as we start today. I'm Bill Hemmer. Dana's got the day off today. Welcome back to you, JB. Good morning.
Yeah, good to be here on a Monday with you, Bill. Cool. I'm Julie Banderas. This is America's Newsroom. So the White House is bracing for tomorrow's consumer confidence report. It is expected to be the lowest reading in more than a year, setting off alarm bells on a potential recession. So it's also, the administration is also trying to get ahead of the GDP number, which comes out later this week. Economists say a second quarter of negative growth would also signal a recession. That prompts the White House now to go into spin overdrive like this.
I would be amazed if the NBER would declare this period to be a recession, even if it happens to have 2 quarters of negative growth. We've got a very strong labor market. When you're creating almost 400,000 jobs a month, that is not a recession.
Has inflation peaked?
I think probably. You know, there's so much out of our control. Inflation is a global problem.
The fact that gas prices are coming down in the summer is really extraordinarily rare. That's not something you see very often. They've fallen every single day since the summer started. That's progress, but it's not enough, and we need to keep working on this.
We begin with Jillian Turner this morning, reporting live from the White House. Good morning, Jillian.
Good morning to you, Julie and Bill. The president is still in isolation here at the White House. We did not see him at all over the weekend, and we will not see him, at least in person, before Wednesday. His physician wrote in a letter over the weekend that his primary symptom is a sore throat. But this just in, we're going to hear direct from the White House COVID coordinator, at least this afternoon, Dr. Jha, so we'll get some more information for you then. Now all eyes are on this, the forthcoming GDP report. As you mentioned a moment ago, the White House appears to be trying to get ahead of what may very well be a second consecutive quarter of negative growth. Take a listen to Brian Deese.
We have real global challenges here in the short term. We've got to navigate our way through them, but we have to do so without giving up all our economic gains. That's going to be our focus, and I think that we need to train that focus on that rather than on sort of technical debates about backward-looking data.
Economists anticipating knowledge of a recession should definitely not hold their breath. Take a listen to Janet Yellen yesterday.
This is not an economy that's in recession, but we're in a period of transition in which growth is slowing, and that's necessary and appropriate. A recession is a broad-based contraction that affects many sectors of the economy. We just don't have that.
That's not all. The Council of Economic Advisors now appears to be redefining the terms that constitute what a recession is on their blog. They write, quote, while some maintain that 2 consecutive quarters of falling real GDP constitutes a recession, that's neither the official definition nor the way economists evaluate the state of the business cycle. This just in moments ago, the White House tells us that the president will follow CDC guidance for masking when he comes out of isolation. This despite the fact, as we all know, that he is going above and beyond the CDC guidance for the isolation period itself. Julie, back to you.
All right, Julian Turner, thank you.
So I want to bring in our panel, Doug Heye, former RNC Comms Director, Harold Ford Jr., co-host of The Five. Good morning, gentlemen. Great to have you both on today. A couple whoppers in there. Inflation, so much out of our control. I guess you go after regulation and taxes. Different argument. Larry Summers is back at it yet again. Over the weekend, here he is.
I think there's a very high likelihood of recession when we've been in this kind of situation before. Recession has essentially always followed when inflation has been high and unemployment has been low. Soft landings represent a kind of triumph of hope over experience. I think we're very unlikely to see one.
So, Doug and Harold, for the purpose of this conversation, you're both economists, okay? Doug, how do we read it?
Well, look, there's no good news that we're seeing from this. You know, every bit of economic news that we see is bad. And what the White House wants to highlight is, gas prices are down over the summer, which is true, but it's not true if you look at it from the day that Joe Biden was sworn in. And so the analogy I would use, using myself as an example, was, a week and a half ago, I was in Missouri for several days, and I ate burnt ends, brisket, and ribs, and I gained 8 pounds. I've lost 4 pounds since then. Doesn't mean I'm ahead of the game. I can't highlight the 4 pounds that I lost because I was up 8 pounds. And this is where our economy is right now. It's where gas prices are right now. It's nice to point out people are seeing gas prices come down, but they know where gas prices were a year ago and a year and a half ago, and that's where they're feeling real pain.
Fair enough. Harold, what about it?
Well, I hope Doug loses the additional 4, the remaining 4. And good morning.
This, Doug.
I think you have to look at news. You have to look at news, economic news, in reality. And I'm one that's called balls and strikes on this administration when they've not, I think, done things more proactively around energy, around supply chain updates and things that we're doing to try to relieve the consumer. But when you're creating, I think Secretary Yellen, who I've been critical of at times, but she's right when she says that we've created 400,000 jobs in the last month, and over the last few months, a few 100,000 jobs each month, which kind of contradicts the notion of broad-based contraction. That being said, there have been a lot of politicians who've lost a lot of races trying to tell the American public that you're doing better than you think. I think what the White House has to focus on, if indeed these numbers come out and suggest a second quarter of contraction or declining GDP numbers, is to demonstrate everything that there possibly can be doing to try to lower energy costs and sustain that, to try to ensure that food prices come down, and to try to ensure that we continue to create jobs in this economy. If we do that, then the American people will believe or see, at least find credible the things that the White House is saying.
I think you're exactly right, Harold. So far, they haven't been there. Meanwhile, the numbers don't lie. You're right. Job performance, our Fox polling, approve or disapprove on the economy, 68%. Disapprove. Inflation, 73% disapprove. And now you've got Ron Klain. We heard from him a moment ago. Parse the language in this soundbite here. Watch.
I think the president's approval rating is kind of a reflection of how people feel about what's going on in the country. And some things in our country aren't going well, not because of what the president did, but in fact because of what the president's fighting against.
Do you follow all that, Doug?
Well, sure. What he said is exactly true. Joe Biden's not responsible for all of this, but what people feel is very real. And so much of what we hear, Congressman Ford knows this as well as I do, maybe even better, is that when you have problems in an administration, when you have problems in a political campaign, you want to replace the communicators. It's always the communicators' problem, or their fault. And so we hear a lot of talk about who's the next White House communications director going to be. Is it going to be Liz Allen? Is it going to be Kendry Lammy Barkoff? These are very fair and real questions, but ultimately you're not talking about rearranging the decks on the Titanic or even the Love Boat for that matter. You're talking about what real Americans are feeling every day of their lives when they go to the grocery store, the gas station, or anything else that's going on in their lives. And they don't feel that this country's moving in the right direction. That's true of Republicans, Democrats, and independents.
Okay, but Klain said not because of what the president did, but in fact because of what the president's fighting against. Harold.
Sure, he came in a bad circumstance. We know that, but it's still a real problem.
I'm looking for an interpretation. Harold, can you?
My sense is Doug is right. I agree. He's talking about the pandemic and all of the things that have come out of that, including the challenge of clawing our way back. Look, the country decided 2 years ago, rightly so, I believe, that the right thing to do during the pandemic was to ensure that everyday Americans, everyday workers had an opportunity to stay above water in the midst of something we didn't know what it was. Now, 2 years later, we're still finding ourselves dealing with the aftermath and some of the residual effects of that. You look at 2 years ago, Bill, we had a shortage of truck drivers in the country, which many people attributed to the supply chain challenges or a big aspect of it. Today, we now have a surplus of drivers. Why? Because the markets reacted. What the president has to do is to stay out in front of these things. He has to appear like every successful president who's faced down numbers, to be on the side of everyday Americans and working for them. I think as you talk about rearranging the deck in the White House, some of the people they think about bringing in have to be astute and skilled in getting the president out, not only with politicians and out in Delaware and out in Pennsylvania, but out all across the country, side by side with consumers and Americans who every day are battling either as small business owners, as workers, as hospital workers, and so on. If you do that, you have a fighting chance. But I would remind Doug and Bill one thing also. It's one election at a time. And as we sit here today, Democrats actually are 1 point ahead of Republicans in the voters' preferences for who they want in control of Congress. If Democrats have a better than expected midterm outcome, President Biden will have probably a different standing amongst Democrats and maybe even the voting public.
Very interesting. Meanwhile, you got Newsroom and J.B. Pritzker out of Illinois and California, respectively. They're out there again. Washington Post headline, "Quit Joe Quit. Biden could save the midterms with a one-term pledge." A lot on the left want that to happen. We'll see if that's the case. Gentlemen, thank you. On a Monday, you started off very well today for us today.
Thank you.
Doug High and Harold Ford, please come back. Thank you.
Have a good one.
10 minutes past, small town in big trouble. Its entire police department resigns en masse
during a live stream of a church sermon.
Yo. All right. All right. Yo, all right.
Holy cow. The video obtained by the New York Post. The video shows 3 men dressed in black, masked and armed, as they barged on stage, then tackled the Bishop Lamore Whitehead to the ground. Police say the suspects then took off with around $400,000 worth of jewelry, and they are still at large.
Small community near Raleigh, North Carolina, scrambling to figure out what's next now after the entire police force, including the police chief, walked out. They all quit. Charles Watson has the reason now live in Atlanta. Charles, good morning to you.
Hey, good morning, Bill. As you can imagine, this comes as a shock for folks who live in Kenly, North Carolina, a small town of just about 2,000 people. Their entire police force all gone in a single day. The Kenly police chief, Josh Gibson, who resigned with 4 of his officers, laid the blame squarely on the shoulders of Kenly's newly hired town manager, Justine Jones. In his resignation letter, Gibson writes in part, quote, "In the last 3 years, we have made substantial progress. I had hoped to continue. However, due to the hostile work environment now present in the town of Kenly, I do not believe progress is possible." Now, 2 town clerks also resigned, though specific details of what caused the mass exodus are still unclear. Whatever the case, the news has sent shockwaves through the small town as questions swirl about who should stay and who should go.
Sounds to me like she's trouble and she needs to go.
The town manager knows that we support her. She's only been here a couple of months.
Now, Jones, who was hired through a national search from a group of about 30 candidates, has only been on the job for just 7 weeks. She and Kenly Town Council members had little to say about the resignations following an emergency closed session on Friday. The town's mayor, however, did ensure folks who live there that law enforcement protection would be provided by the county. We spoke to a shop owner there who says that's not good enough.
The county response is anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes at some points. So having a police force, especially owning a pharmacy, not having police presence, for 30 to 40 minutes is quite shocking and alarming.
Yeah. And again, Bill, we don't know of any specific reasons or incidents that caused these officers or those other town employees to quit. We've reached out to the town of Kenly to get more details about what exactly happened. We have not heard back yet, Bill.
Okay, Charles, thank you. Important story there. We'll watch it. Charles Watson. Julie.
All right, our next guest says the quick guilty verdict of the man on trial for the murder of a retired St. Louis police officer during the George Floyd riots in 2020 may be a sign people have had it with woke policies. In a Fox News poll, op-ed Paul Morrow, a retired NYPD inspector, writes this: Dorn murder conviction signals citizens fed up with crime. He joins us now. Steve Cannon, by the way, had been arrested multiple times, as you know, on robbery and assault charges, yet he was out on parole the day of the murder. Why was he not jailed on his probation violation?
So that's a good question, and it's not entirely clear, and that's very much part of the story. Part of that process of keeping somebody like Mr. Cannon in jail is that the prosecutor's office has to show up in court and ask for it. And according to the reporting, it's a little vague, but according to the reporting, he did violate his probation, and he should have been in on the night that he ultimately killed Captain Dorn.
Let's talk about why he was on the street. 2 names: Kim Gardner, the lead prosecutor for the city of St. Louis, because as you know, she is no stranger, and she's just one of many in the country, no stranger to reckless decisions here. In fact, in the past, she actually petitioned the judge to recuse her from this case, and she wanted to appoint a special prosecutor. Why was she trying to avoid trying this case in the first place?
Well, Julie, you asked the right question. I mean, the viewers may be familiar with Ms. Gardner. This is the prosecutor who went forward so strongly on the McCloskey case. The two individuals, the couple that was on its lawn, the two of them were on the lawn when there were demonstrators coming through on private property holding their guns. They had the book thrown at them and ultimately had a plea. The instance that you're talking about here, for whatever reason, in what was likely the biggest case of her career, her office made the contention in court that they were, quote unquote, overburdened to try a case for a career African-American law enforcement officer killed trying to defend a storefront.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the story that Gardner basically insisted on charging Mark and Patricia McCloskey. Let's remind our viewers what they were doing. They were standing on their very own front lawn. They were brandishing legal handguns on their property in response to BLM marchers who were trespassing on private property. Her handling of the incident, it was so egregious that the judge actually barred her from the office, from the case, and the lead detective actually refused to sign, as you remember, those papers to charge this couple. How does she still have a job? And what does this rapid verdict say about the people fed up with these types of woke policies?
You know, I may be seeing a silver lining here, but I do believe that you're starting to see real signs of the public pushing back and waking up to what's going on in our major urban areas. You have San Francisco, Chesa Boudin is out. You have in L.A., Gascon is going to undergo a referendum, and I think there's a good chance he's going to be recalled. They don't have that provision in Missouri, unfortunately, so it looks like, you know, Kim Gardner's job is safe for now. But the fact that the verdict came in so quickly, this was not a slam dunk, as I outlined on the piece that's up on foxnews.com right now. This was a case that really, you know, I actually thought they might end up with a hung jury, and instead 3 hours guilty, all counts. And anybody who's tried a homicide case knows that there's a message embedded in that.
Yeah, no, Gascon, in fact, is essentially responsible for the deaths of 2 police officers, because the man who was charged with their murders should have actually been in jail for 3 years, but instead he was free on the streets. I want to move on to a new editorial from the Wall Street Journal, which suggests that Biden's new Safer America plan, is what they're calling it, is all talk and no action, and is, quote, mostly about political damage control. Following 2 years of Democrats, you know, obviously pushing to defund police, far-left prosecutors like the ones we just spoke of, pushing for less jail time rather than more. What do you make of this headline? It reads, Joe Biden's political SWAT team, the White House does damage control on crime amid growing lawlessness. Are they right?
Well, it's a very different tune from what the administration was singing just about 2 months ago. And a lot has been written about this initiative already. I would make 2 points, if I might, that I haven't seen elsewhere. First of all, federal money never comes without strings, okay? Federal government generally uses these kinds of grants to try to configure policy on the ground. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Here's a quote from then candidate Joe Biden on the campaign trail in 2020. I don't support defunding the police. I support conditioning federal aid to police based on whether or not they meet certain basic standards. All right, he said that. So I don't think it's a reach to think that someplace embedded in this very likely is going to be the kind of things that the federal government wants to happen on the ground. But there is good news, and that is that in this release that they put out, they talk about task forces, gun task forces. Julie, that's the metric right there.
Yeah.
If they set those up in the same way that they set up the Joint Terrorist Task Forces after 9/11 and put federal, state, and locals together, making federal cases, which gets you out of the prosecutors that we're talking about here, then you're going to see something. If they're doing that, this is real.
Okay. That's all the time we have. Paul Morrow, though, thank you very much. Interesting article. Got to read his op-ed. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you.
You know, this isn't the first time Paul has done this. And it's not that he's buying stock. He's buying calls and puts. He's buying options.
Yeah. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy.
Over the course of your career, has your husband ever made a stock purchase or sale based on information you received from him?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
Okay, that's House Speaker Nancy Pelosi denying her husband ever bought or sold stocks using information that she knew. This as the push to ban congressional stock trading remains stalled. Hillary Vaughn of Fox Business is live on Capitol Hill with more for us this morning. Good morning, Hillary.
Good morning, Julie. Well, the Senate is set to vote on a bill that would give $52 billion in subsidies to the U.S. chip-making industry. That would be a big win for them, but it could also be a big win for Speaker Pelosi's husband, Paul, who made a $1 million investment in the chip industry last month. If this bill passes and the president signs it, it could make Mr. Pelosi a lot of money. Paul Pelosi disclosed $1 million stock purchase of a major chip maker, NVIDIA, in June. The timing of that stock buy before this legislation gets passed is getting some backlash. So now some lawmakers are pushing to finally vote on a bill that's been introduced for months that would ban members of Congress and their spouses from trading stocks while in office due to conflicts of interest. There's even bipartisan support from unlikely places like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Josh Hawley, who both support the idea, but still that bill is sitting stalled in the House.
One person that controls the whole House can determine what bill comes out of committee, what bill comes to the floor, is the Speaker of the House. And Paul Pelosi and Nancy Pelosi made $5 million the last time this happened.
Speaker Pelosi's spokesperson told me last week that the Speaker does not own any stocks personally, and she also has no prior knowledge or involvement in any transactions. But some lawmakers say whether or not she is making these trades or knows about them is not the point. She still stands to profit from what her husband is buying and selling. And since he made this big bet, Julie, NVIDIA's stock has risen by 10%. So he potentially off this deal could have already made over $500,000. Julie?
All right, Hillary Vaughn, thank you.
More to come, maybe, too. Charlie Gasparino, Fox Business with me here. Charlie, nice to see you. Good morning. On the smell meter, 1 to 10, what's it smell like?
It's horrible. And, you know, listen, insider trading is not easy to prove. It has to be material, non-public information that's stolen, okay? You have to have that misappropriation thing. You need to steal it either from a company like its earnings or from the American people via legislation that no one knows about, you know, secret briefings, whatever. Stuff that his wife would be privy to, obviously. The problem is that some of this stuff is bouncing around. His timing, though, is impeccable on the video because if you notice, I went back and I looked at it. There's been talk about this CHIPS Act to give money for the chip makers going back 6-8 months. But when he bought it, it was exactly the time when it looked like there was bipartisan buy-in on this. It looked like McConnell was ready to go, which made the trade very advantageous. Again, I'm not saying that's insider trading. I don't think it is. There have been cases, though, we should point out, of pillow talk insider trading cases. A famous analyst on Wall Street, I covered it when I was at the Wall Street Journal, gave insider tips to his porn star girlfriend. Oh. And she got caught. I've seen it several times. So this does
funny
happen.
How you remember that story,
Yes,
right,
yes.
Charlie? Let me show our viewers a couple things here. First of all, some options he put down on Tesla.
Yeah.
This was December of 2020. So you can make the case the information was out there. Biden was pushing for green energy.
And they, by the way, the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, so...
Right, and the
good
election
chance it's
was
gonna
over
happen.
that time, too. Here's the NVIDIA deal that Hillary just mentioned. Purchase options, $1 to $5 million. You have the Competes Act, the CHIPS Act. It's still floating around Congress. If it passes, you're giving this industry more than $50 billion, okay?
His timing was pretty good on it.
Here's the thing that kind of riddles me a little bit. Microsoft, $2 to $10 million. What I did not realize is that the U.S. military, the Pentagon, was negotiating with Microsoft at the time, and then later, a couple months later, they announced a contract.
They announced the contract.
That's kind of the dealio. Go ahead.
But you don't know. Listen, I have to go back and check that. But I bet there were stories about this out there, and you know, he's in Silicon Valley.
Out there meaning it could have been in the Wall Street Journal.
It could have been on the internet, and you know, that's how a lot of these guys. You know, the legislative stuff is much harder to prove than the other stuff because obviously a company keeps its earnings reports very sacrosanct. Legislation is always bouncing around. That's why Richard Burr of North Carolina essentially did not get charged by the Justice Department for trading stocks after he received a pandemic briefing.
Because it's not illegal.
Well, no.
These lawmakers have always been asked.
It was illegal if he had inside information, but people were talking about the pandemic way before it happened, right? I mean, Donald Trump was pressed on it at Davos in January. He can easily say, and which is what he did, hey, I got this from the internet. I saw it on Fox Business, a real debate about the pandemic and whether you have to lock down. So I got scared and I sold. So remember, this legislative stuff is difficult. Now, the real question is, do we stop the sleaze? I mean, they clearly have an information edge. There's no doubt. I mean, tell me Nancy Pelosi is not speaking about some of this stuff with Paul Pelosi. The guy is 80 years old. This is what I don't get. It's kind of degenerate in a sense. He's 80 years old. He's worth much more than $100 million, I'm sure. And that's the sort of estimated number. And he's gambling with stocks still. If you're that obsessed with stocks, my view, you're asking your wife what's going on. That's just my humble opinion.
You write in the New York Post, Nancy and Paul Pelosi are trading large with a wealth of hypocrisy. It may not be illegal, but it sure does look scummy. The Pelosis are in positions of influence with access to information not available to most Americans. They have no shame taking millions while Nancy Pelosi leads a party that's dedicated to virtue signaling about the sins of capitalism. There should be a law against that. End quote. Now, there has been a push to get a law to prevent lawmakers from trading stocks.
Yeah.
And it has not happened.
I'm of two minds with this. It's legal. You should be able to do it. But the other half is clearly they have an information edge. And the public looks at this and says, this is disgusting. How come they're getting a benefit and I don't? So, and by the way, this is what drives me crazy about Paul Pelosi. He doesn't have to do this. I mean, why is he doing it? I mean, he's rich already. I mean,
my dad told me in the 4th grade. Said it's never enough, Billy.
It's
never, even for the billionaires, it's never enough. Last word.
I used to see my father trade between 3 bookies, but I know why he did it. I don't know why this guy's doing it.
He was running.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie. Nice to see you.
All right.
Julie, what's next?
All right, a brazen robbery here in New York City, but what happened before that is even more shocking. We're going to show you. Top of the hour. A dire new warning from the Pentagon about China's military aggression. General Jack Keane on that next.
As the country.
Over the course of your career, has your husband ever made a stock purchase or sale based on information he received from you?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, that's House Speaker Nancy Pelosi denying her husband ever bought or sold stocks using information that she knew. This as the push to ban congressional stock trading remains stalled. Hillary Vaughn of Fox Business is live on Capitol Hill with more for us this morning. Good morning, Hillary.
Good morning, Julie. Well, the Senate is set to vote on a bill that would give $52 billion in subsidies to the U.S. chip-making industry. That would be a big win for them, but it could also be a big win for Speaker Pelosi's husband, Paul, who made a $1 million investment in the chip industry last month. If this bill passes and the president signs it, it could make Mr. Pelosi a lot of money. Paul Pelosi disclosed $1 million stock purchase of a major chip maker, NVIDIA, in June. The timing of that stock buy before this legislation gets passed is getting some backlash. So now some lawmakers are pushing to finally vote on a bill that's been introduced for months that would ban members of Congress and their spouses from trading stocks while in office due to conflicts of interest. There's even bipartisan support from unlikely places like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Josh Hawley, who both support the idea, but still that bill is sitting stalled in the House.
One person that controls the whole House can determine